Well, one question maybe to all of you, and starting maybe with Lourdes, but then Dr. Ilse Kong and Jacob Frankel also. You know, when we discuss the G20, there of course are always, we remember two G20s in a way. There's the leaders meeting, which we're really talking about, but there has always been not always, but there has for many years been the finance ministers G20. Mm-hmm. And of course, because the leaders meeting kind of grew out of the finance ministers meeting, it is closely linked. So there are two questions here. To what degree do you see that leaders G20 remain very much linked to the finance ministers, or is the leaders meeting now increasingly also one where the foreign ministers play a very important role? So that's one question. And the second question, maybe a little more provocative. When you think about it, the finance ministers meet not exactly the same, but a group that is quite similar, but on a constituency basis as the International Monetary and Financial Committee. So there is a meeting, you know, within the IMF framework of about 24 finance ministers. Almost not all, but many of the G20 ministers are part of that. Then there are some others. Would there be some logic in preserving the leaders G20? So the leaders G20 meet as leaders, you know, and as they have in Seoul and as they will in Mexico and so on. But do we really need a separate finance ministers G20 and the IMF Monetary Financial Committee, or could we have a scenario in the future where these two meetings of finance ministers kind of merge into one? Any thoughts on either of the two questions, you know, whichever you feel?
Well, I will take on the first one because the second one, I don't want my finance minister to get upset with me if I say, if I don't answer correctly. But I think it was, Ilse Kong was very clear when he said, it's not the summit, just the event. It's a process. And to get to the summit, we need all the preparation and all the review that the different vice ministers level meeting takes place, the Sherpa meetings, and then the financial ministers. Because, I mean, for now, we have the mutual assessment process, which has to be done on a very regular basis, and it cannot be done at the Leaders Summit. It has to be done all along the year. There are several very technical issues that have to be discussed in various forums before the summit. So the summit is a place where you give the political input to the process, in which you say which is the way these summits the next year will take place. So I do believe that the leaders themselves don't have to go and sit down and review exactly the IMF quotas or other issues, but they are the ones who give us the guidance to all of us. And eventually, and I said eventually, I don't think they will have to deal only with economic and financial issues, but also with other issues. There has been sometimes on the table the trade issue, which so far the leaders haven't been able to give, I mean, all the political support for it to be solved. But that's where, I mean, we have to work for the leaders to give exactly the instructions and the way that we should follow up working. So far, there have never been a foreign ministers meeting. I don't think it's ruled out. I think eventually, as I said, the G20 will have to take on also on political issues. And the one that it's important is the governance issue. I mean, what's the role of the G20 vis-a-vis what's happening in other international fora? And the big discussion of why is the G20 assuming the decision-making of important issues without incorporating all country states. I mean, this discussion is very much being held at the UN, and there's reluctance by some countries that the G20 believes it's the one who has to deal with them. So I do think that's material for foreign ministers to keep on discussing the issue of global governance. Prime Minister Cameron presented a very, very thorough report on global governance, which we still have to follow up on it, and it can be done through the foreign ministers. But I insist, this is an evolving process, and the G20 has to learn from previous mistakes, from its own mistakes, and see how we can really work on breaking stalemates that we have at the international level at the moment. And I think I will leave Itzhak Kong with
first, let us thank you for your...
Thank you.
Dr. Itzhak Kong, any thoughts on the IMFC versus G20 finance?
Okay. Let me, I think Kamal just raised this question for clarification. I think when we say G20, in my view, it is a summit. We're talking about G20 summit. In the midst of worsening global financial crisis, leaders decided to meet. They didn't know it was 20 or 14 or 15, but they decided 20 because already finance ministers meeting. So why don't we utilize this finance ministers meeting, which is already meeting? And so they somehow, and you know there are all kinds of background stories, but they ended up with G20. So assuming that there was no G20 finance ministers meeting, and leaders decided to hold the G20 summit, it is very natural to have G20 finance ministers meeting to support the summit, you see. So we have G20 summit process. To support this, we have G20 finance ministers meeting. To support this, we have finance G20 deputies meeting. And then to support this, again, we have a G20 Sherpas meeting. So it's all integral part of this G20 summit, you see. It's not separate. It's not separate. This G20 finance ministers meet to support the leaders to make the strategic and important decisions. Now, and then Korea added Business Summit again. Again, usually when you say Business Summit, usually Business Summit in the held along with some summits was they just held at the time of the summit. But the Business Summit, the G20 Business Summit is now integral part of summit process. In other words, business leaders are not meeting separately from this G20 summit, but they meet there as a part of this whole process because their input is directly channeled into summit process. And some of the recommendations will be and has been reflected in the communique. So we have business summit and finance ministers meeting, and the deputies meeting, and this Sherpas meeting, and then it's if G20 after the establish itself as a functioning steering committee, we may want to include the foreign ministers meeting for security matters, or maybe even the labor ministers meeting to. For employment reasons. Actually, in Ghana, they had this L20, what they call. But I thought that once you include, it's not just ministers meeting that is important. It is the process again. They have to come up with, they have to work all along and then come up with some decision which will be made by the ministers and then submitted to the leaders so that the leaders can take decision on. Okay, so I think this is the relationship between finance ministers meeting and the G20's, the heads of nations meeting. And with regard to IMFC and the G20, yeah, there's been already discussion on this issue. IMFC is based on constituency base, and it complicates again. It's organized, you know. So I think eventually there's some the formal structural relationship with this IMF, but at this stage, I think it is the topic to be discussed, to further explored. But at this point, I think it's complicated the process of the G20 itself.
Okay, well, as a moderator in the conference, I am, it's my duty to press you a little bit hard.
Right.
And I think the G20 has been a huge step forward for the world economy, and as you all said, in bringing in the major emerging market players. Jacob with figures showed how the world has changed and how having, having meetings on the world economy without Mexico, without Korea, without Brazil, without China, it really doesn't make sense, without Turkey also. But on the other hand, I mean, it is part of the discussion. What do we say to Egypt, that is not, it's a major country of the same population size than many, or larger than many G20 countries? What do we say to Colombia? I know my Colombian friends who are good friends with Mexico and good friends with Argentina, but they also feel we're a major Latin American country. Are we going to be forever excluded? What do we say to Nigeria, which is a huge African country, and is not part of the G20? So that is part of the criticism. That is something we have to face. Yeah. I think the link to the IMF makes it a little bit easier in my view, because everybody is a member of the IMF. But what do you say to Nigeria, to Egypt, to Colombia?
Yeah. Well,
you start, Mr. Sakong, and then we'll ask Lourdes.
Ideally, as well as I do.
Then you give yours.
What the global community needs is G192, right? And what happened in Copenhagen? And so you cannot include everyone.
No.
So G20 covers more than 85% of global GDP and 2/3 of global population. The important thing is that G20 should have very, very active, the active outreach activities with those countries, not included in the group. In fact, Korea even designated an ambassador who will full-time engage with these countries outside the G20. We say, look, Korea is here, so we can represent you. And we know your priorities and your concerns and your agony is better than anyone, so let's work together. So I think, you cannot have G193 to work together. So previously, you only had the G7, right? And then now you include emerging economies. So you have to compromise somewhere. So I think the important thing is outreach activities. Yes.